Chapter 8 of The Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Luna. The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 8. The Paragraph. I was up betimes. Would Mrs. Packard appear at breakfast? I hardly thought so. Yet, who knows? Such women have great recuperative powers, and from one so mysteriously affected anything might be expected. Ready at 8, I hastened down to the second floor to find the lady, concerning whom I had had these doubts, awaiting me on the threshold of her room. She was carefully dressed, and looked pale enough to have been up for hours. An envelope was in her hand, and the smile which hailed my approach was cold and constrained. "Good morning," said she. "Let us go down. Let us go down together. I slept wretchedly, and do not feel very strong. When did Mr. Parker come in?" "Late. He went directly to the library. He said that he had but a short time in which to rest, and would take what sleep he could get on the lounge. When I told him of your very natural nervous attack." She sighed, a sigh which came from no inconsiderable depth. Then, with a proud and resolute gesture, preceded me downstairs. Her husband was already in the breakfast-room. I could hear his voice as we turned at the foot of the stairs. Mrs. Packard, hearing it too, drew herself up still more firmly and was passing bravely forward, when Nixon's gray head protruded from the doorway and I heard him say, "There's company for breakfast, ma'am." His Honor could not spare Mr. Steele and asked me to set a place for him. I noted a momentary hesitation on Mrs. Packard's part. Then she silently acquiesced, and we both passed on. In another instant we were receiving the greetings and apologies of the gentlemen. If Mr. Steele had expected that his employer's wife would offer him her hand, he was disappointed. "I am happy to welcome one who has proved so useful to my husband," she remarked with cool though careful courtesy as we all sat down at the table, and, without waiting for an answer, she proceeded to pour the coffee with a proud grace which gave no hint of the extreme feeling by which I had seen her moved the night before. Had I known her better, I might have found something extremely unnatural in her manner, and the very evident restraint she put upon herself through the whole meal. But not having any acquaintance with her ordinary bearing under conditions purely social, I was thrown out of my calculations by the cold ease with which she presided at her end of the table, and the set smile with which she greeted all remarks, whether volunteered by her husband or by his respectful but affable secretary. I noticed, however, that she ate little. Nixon, whom I dared not watch, did not serve with his usual precision. This I perceived from the surprised look cast at him by Mayor Packard on at least 2 occasions. Though to the ordinary eye a commonplace meal, it had elements of tragedy in it which made the least movement on the part of those engaged in it of real moment to me. I was about to leave the table unlightened, however, when Mrs. Packard rose and drawing a letter from under the tray before which she sat, let her glances pass from one gentleman to the other with a look of decided inquiry. I drew in my breath, and by dropping my handkerchief, sought an excuse to linger in the room an instant longer. "May I ask one of you," she stammered with her first show of embarrassment during the meal, to post this letter for me?" Both gentlemen were standing and both gentlemen reached for it, but it was into the secretary's hand she put it, though her husband's was much nearer. As Mr. Steele received it, he gave it the casual glance natural, under the circumstances, a glance which instantly, however, took on an air of surprise that ended in a smile. "Have you not made some mistake?" he asked. "This does not look like a letter." And he handed her back the paper she had given him, with an involuntary ingathering of her breath. She seemed to wake out of some dream, and looking down at the envelope she held, she crushed it in her hand with a little laugh in which I heard the note of real gaiety for the first time. pardon me!" she exclaimed, and meeting his amused gaze with one equally expressive, she carelessly added, "I certainly brought a letter down with me." Bowing pleasantly, but with that indefinable air of respect which bespeaks the stranger, he waited while she hastened back to the tray and drew from under it a second paper. "Pardon my carelessness," she said. "I must have caught up a scrawl of the baby's in taking this from my desk." She brought forward a letter and ended the whole remarkable episode by handing it now to her husband, who, with an apologetic glance at the other, put it in his pocket. I say remarkable, for in the folded slip which had passed back and forth between her and the secretary I saw, or thought I saw, a likeness to the paper she had brought the night before out of the attic. If Mayor Packard saw anything unusual in his wife's action, he made no mention of it when I went into his study at 9 o'clock, and it was so much of an enigma to me that I was not ready to venture a question regarding it. Her increased spirits and more natural conduct were the theme of the few sentences he addressed me, and while he urged precaution and a continued watch upon his wife, he expressed the fondest hope that he should find her fully restored on his return at the end of 2 weeks. I encouraged his hopes and possibly shared them, but I changed my mind, as he probably did his, when a few minutes later we met her in the hall, hurrying towards us with a newspaper in her hand and a ghastly look on her face. "See, see, what they have dared to print!" she cried, with a look full of anguish into his bewildered face. He took the sheet, read, and flushed, then suddenly grew white. "Outrageous!" he exclaimed. Then tenderly, "My poor darling, that they should dare to drag your name into this abominable campaign!" "And for no reason!" she faltered. "There is nothing wrong with me. You believe that? You are sure of that?" she cried. I saw the article later. It ran something like this: "Rumor has it that not even our genial mayor's closet is free from the proverbial skeleton. Mrs. Packard's health is not what it was, and some say that the causes are not purely physical." He tried to dissimulate. Putting his arm about her, he kissed her fondly and protested, with mingled energy and feeling, "I believe you to be all you should be, a true woman and true wife." Her face lighted, and she clung for a moment in passionate delight to his breast. Then she caught his look, which was tender but not altogether open, and the shadows fell again as she murmured, "You are not satisfied. Oh, what do you see? What do others see that I should be in the subject of doubt? Tell me. I can never right myself till I know." "I see a troubled face when I should see a happy one," he answered lightly. Then, as she still clung in very evident question to his arm, he observed gravely, "2 weeks ago you were the life of this house, and of every other house into which your duties carried you. Why shouldn't you be the same to-day? Answer me that, dear, and all my doubts will vanish, I assure you." "Henry," drooping her head and lacing her fingers in and out with nervous hesitation, "you will think me very foolish. I know that I will sound foolish, childish even, and utterly ridiculous, but I can explain myself no other way. I have had a frightful experience here in my own house, on the spot where I have been so happy, so unthinkably happy. Henry, do not laugh. It is real, very real to me. The spectre which is said to haunt these halls has revealed itself to me. I have seen the ghost." End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of The Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lois Hill. The Mayor's Wife by Katharine Green. Chapter 9. Scraps. We did not laugh. We did not even question her sanity. At least I did not. There was too much meaning in her manner. A spectre. her husband repeated, with a suggestive glance at the brilliant sunshine in which we all stood. Yes. The tone was one of utter conviction. I had never believed in such things, never thought about them, but it was a week ago, in the library. I have not seen a happy moment since. My darling. Yes, yes, I know, but imagine. I was sitting reading. I had just come from the nursery, and the memory of Laura's good night kiss was more in my mind than the story I was finishing when, oh, I cannot think of it without a shudder. The page before me seemed to recede and the words fade away in a blue mist. Glancing up, I beheld the outlines of a form between me and the lamp, which a moment before had been burning brightly. Outlines, Henry. I was conscious of no substance, and the eyes which met mine from that shadowy, blood-curdling something were those of the grave and meant a grave for you or for me. Oh, I know what I say. There was no mistaking their look. As it burned into and through me, everything which had given reality to my life faded and seemed as far away and as unsubstantial as a dream. Nor has its power over me gone yet. I go about amongst you, I eat, I sleep, or try to. I greet men, talk with women, but it is all unreal, all phantasmagoric, even yourself and your love and, oh God, my baby. What is real and distinctive, an absolute part of me and my life, is that shape from the dead, with its threatening eyes which pierce. She was losing her self-control. Her husband, with a soothing touch on her arm, brought her back to the present. "You speak of a form," he said, "a shadowy outline. The form of what? A man or a woman?" "A man! A man!" With the exclamation she seemed to shrink into herself, and her eyes, just now deprecating and appealing, took on a hollow stare, as if the vision she described had risen again before her. In spite of himself and the sympathy he undoubtedly felt for her, an ejaculation of impatience left her husband's lips. Obligations very far removed from the fantasies of a disturbed mind made these unsubstantial fears of hers seem puerile enough to this virile, outspoken man. No doubt she heard it, and to stop the matter-of-fact protest on his lips, added quickly, "Not the form, face, and eyes of a man, as they usually appear. Hell was in his gaze, and the message he gave, if it was a message, was one of disaster, if not death. Do you wonder that my happiness vanished before it? That I cannot be myself since that dreadful day?" The mayor was a practical man. He kept close to the subject. "You saw this form between you and the lighted lamp. How long did it stay there, and what became of it?" "I cannot tell you. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, and I found myself staring into vacancy. I seem to be staring there still, waiting for the blow destined to shatter this household." "Nonsense! Give me a kiss and fix your thoughts on something more substantial. What we have to fear, and all we have to fear, is that I may lose my election. And that won't kill me, whatever effect it may have on the party." "Henry." Her voice had changed to one more natural, also her manner. The confidence expressed in this outburst, the vitality, the masculine attitude he took were producing their effect. "You don't believe in what I saw or in my fears. Perhaps you are right. I am ready to acknowledge this. I will try to look upon it all as a freak of my imagination, if you will promise to forget these dreadful days, and if people, other people, will leave me alone and not print such things about me." "I'm ready to do my part," was his glad reply. "And as for the other people you mention, we shall soon bring them to book." Raising his voice, he called out his secretary's name. As it rang loud and cheery down the hall, the joy and renewed life, which had been visible in her manner, lost some of their brightness. "What are you going to do?" she gasped, with the quickness of doubt and strong if reasonless apprehension. "Give an order," he explained. Then, as the secretary appeared at our end of the hall, he held out the journal which he had taken from his wife, and indicating the offensive paragraph, said, "Find out who did that." Mr. Steele, with a surprised look, ran his eyes over the paragraph, knitting his brows as he did. "It is calumny," fell from Mrs. Packard's lips as she watched him. "Most certainly," he assented, with an energy which brought a flush of pleasure to the humiliated woman's cheek. "It will detain me 2 days or more to follow up this matter," he remarked, with a look of inquiry directed at Mayor Packard. Never mind. 2 days or a week, it is all one. I would rather lose votes than pass over such an insult. Pin me down the man who has dared attack me through my wife, and you will do me the greatest favor one man can show another." Mr. Steele bowed. "I cannot forego the final consultation we had planned to hold on the train. May I ride down with you to the station?" "Certainly. Most happy." Mr. Steele withdrew, after casting a glance of entirely respectful sympathy at the woman who up to this hour had faced the world without a shadow between her and it, and marking the lingering nature of the look with which the mayor now turned on his wife, I followed the secretary's example and left them to enjoy their few last words alone. Verily the pendulum of events swung wide and fast in this house. This conclusion was brought back to me with fresh insistence a few minutes later, when, on hearing the front door shut, I stepped to the balustrade and looked over to see if Mrs. Packard was coming up. She was not, for I saw her go into the library, but plainly on the marble pavement below, just where we had all been standing, in fact, I perceived the piece of paper she had brought with her from the dining room and had doubtless dropped in the course of the foregoing conversation. Running down in great haste, I picked it up. This scrap of I knew not what, but which had been the occasion of the enigmatic scene I had witnessed at the breakfast table, necessarily interested me very much, and I could not help giving it a look. I saw that it was inscribed with Hebraic looking characters as unlike as possible to the scrawl of a little child. With no means of knowing whether they were legible or not, these characters made a surprising impression upon me, one, indeed, that was almost photographic. I also noted that these shapes or characters, of which there were just 7, were written on the face of an empty envelope. This decided any doubts I may have had as to its identity with the paper she had brought down from the attic. That had been a square sheet, which even if folded would fail to enter this long and narrow envelope. The interest which I had felt when I thought the two identical was a false interest. Yet I could not but believe that this scrap had a value of its own, equal to the one with which, under this misapprehension, I had invested it. Carrying it back to Mrs. Packard, I handed it over with the remark that I had found it lying in the hall. She cast a quick look at it, gave me another look, and tossed the paper into the grate. As it caught fire and flared up, the characters started vividly into view. This second glimpse of them, added to the one already given me, fixed the whole indelibly in my mind. This is the way they looked. While I watched these cabalistic marks pass from red to black and finally vanish in a wild leap up the chimney, Mrs. Packard remarked: "I wish I could destroy the memory of all my mistakes as completely as I can that old envelope." I did not answer. I was watching the weary droop of her hand over the arm of her chair. "You are tired, Mrs. Packard," was my sympathetic observation. "Will you not take a nap? I will gladly sit by you and read you to sleep." "No, no," she cried, at once alert and active. "No sleep. Look at that pile of correspondence, half of it on charitable matters. Now that I feel better, now that I've relieved my mind, I must look over my letters and try to take up the old threads again." "Can I help you?" I asked. "Possibly. If you will go to my room upstairs, I will join you after I have sorted and read my mail." I was glad to obey this order. I had a curiosity about her room. It had been the scene of much I did not understand the night before. Should I find any traces there of that search which had finally ended, over my head, in the attic? I was met at the door by Ellen. She wore a look of dismay, which I felt fully accounted for when I looked inside. Disorder reigned from one end of the room to the other, transcending any picture I may have formed in my own mind concerning its probable condition. Mrs. Packard must have forgotten all this disarray, or at least had supposed it to have yielded to the efforts of the maid, when she proposed my awaiting her there. There were bureau drawers with their contents half on the floor, boxes with their covers off, cupboard doors ajar, and even the closet shelves showing every mark of a frenzied search among them. Her rich gown, soiled to the width of half a foot around the bottom, lay with cut laces and its trimmings in rags under a chair which had been knocked over and left where it fell. Even her jewels had not been put away, but lay scattered on the dresser. Ellen looked ashamed, and when I retired to the one bare place I saw, in the bay of the window, muttered as she plunged to lift one of the great boxes: "It's as bad as the attic room upstairs. All the trunks have been emptied onto the floor, and one held her best summer dresses. What shall I do? I have a whole morning's work before me." "Let me help you," I proposed, rising with sudden alacrity. My eyes had just fallen on a small desk at my right, also on the floor beneath and around it. Here, there, and everywhere, above and below, lay scraps of torn up paper, and on many, if not on all of them, could be seen the broken squares and inverted angles which had marked so curiously the surface of the envelope she had handed to Mr. Steele, and which I had afterward seen her burn. "A baby could make a deal of mess," I remarked, hurriedly collecting these scraps and making a motion of throwing them into the waste paper basket, but hiding them in my blouse instead. "The baby? Oh, the baby never did that. She's too young." "Oh, I didn't know. I haven't seen much of the child, though I heard her cry once in the nursery. How old is she?" 20 months, and such a darling. You never saw such curls or such eyes. Why, look at this." "What?" I demanded, hurrying to the closet, where Ellen stood bending over something invisible to me. "Oh, nothing," she answered, coming quickly out. But in another moment, her tongue getting the better of her discretion, she blurted out: "Do you suppose Mrs. Packard had any idea of going with the mayor? Her bag is in there almost packed. I was wondering where all her toilet articles were. That accounts—" Stopping, she cast a glance around the room, ending with a shake of the head and a shrug. "She needn't have pulled out all her things," she sharply complained. "Certain she is a mysterious lady, as queer as she is kind." End of chapter 9. Recording by Lois Hill, Kamiah, Idaho. Chapter 10 of The Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lois Hill. The Mayor's Wife by Katharine Green. Chapter 10. A Glimmer of the Truth. This was a sentiment I could thoroughly endorse. Mrs. Packard was certainly an enigma to me. Leaving Ellen to finish her work, I went upstairs to my own room, and taking out the scraps of paper I had so carefully collected, spread them out before me on the lid of the desk. They were absolutely unintelligible to me, marks and nothing more. Useless to waste time over such unmeaning scrawls when I had other and more tangible subjects to consider. But I should not destroy them. There might come a time when I should be glad to give them the attention which my present excitement forbade. Putting them back in my desk, I settled myself into a serious contemplation of the one fact which seemed to give a partial, if not wholly satisfactory, explanation of Mrs. Packard's peculiar conduct during the last 2 weeks. Her belief that she had been visited by a specter of an unholy, threatening aspect. That it was a belief and nothing more seemed sufficiently clear to me in the cold-blooded analysis to which I now subjected the whole matter. Phantoms have no place in the economy of nature. That Mrs. Packard thought herself the victim of one was simply a proof of how deeply, though perhaps unconsciously, she had been affected by the traditions of the house. Such sensitiveness in a mind naturally firm and uncommonly well poised called for attention. Yet a physician had asserted that he could do nothing for her. Granting that he was mistaken, would an interference of so direct and unmistakable a character be wise in the present highly strung condition of her nerves? I doubted it. It would show too plainly the light in which we regarded her. I dared not undertake the responsibility of such a course in Mayor Packard's absence. Some other way must be found to quiet her apprehensions and bring her into harmony again with her surroundings. I knew of only one course. If the influence of the house had brought on this hallucination, then the influence of the house must be destroyed. She must be made to see that, despite its unfortunate reputation, no specter had ever visited it, that some purely natural cause was at the bottom of the various manifestations which had successively driven away all previous tenants. Could I hope to effect this? It was an undertaking of no small moment. Had I the necessary judgment? I doubted it, but my ambition was roused. While Mr. Steele was devoting himself to the discovery of Mayor and Mrs. Packard's political enemy, I would essay the more difficult task of penetrating the mystery threatening their domestic peace. I could but fail; a few inquiries would assure me of the folly or the wisdom of my course. Having reached this point and satisfied myself as to my real duty, I rose to leave my room for another word or two with Ellen. As I did so, my eyes fell on the shade still drawn between me and the next house. The impulse to raise it was irresistible. I must see if either of the two old faces still occupied that gable window. It was not likely. It was not in ordinary human nature to keep up so unremitting a watch. Yet, as the shade flew up at my touch, I realized that my astonishment would have been great and my expectations altogether disappointed if I had not encountered the fixed countenance and the set stare with which I had come to connect this solitary window. Miss Charity was there, and though I now knew what underlay her senile, if not utterly mad, watch, the impression made upon me by her hopeless countenance was as keen as it had ever been, and lent point and impetus to the task I had just set for myself. It was apparent that Mrs. Packard had forgotten, or changed her mind, about joining me in her own room, but nevertheless I went out to discover what possible duty she might have laid out for me. Ascertaining from Ellen that Mrs. Packard had engagements which would take her out at noon, I waited for that hour to pass, then excused myself and went out also. The owner of the house, whose shaded history I was now determined to learn, was John Searles, a real estate agent. To his office in Main Street I at once proceeded, not without doubts and much inward trepidation, but buoyed up by the assurance of Mayor Packard's approval of any attempt, however far-fetched or unpromising, which held out the least possibility of relieving Mrs. Packard from her superstitious fears and restoring the peace and happiness of the household. If only Mr. Searles should prove to be an approachable man! I had never seen him or heard him spoken of, or I should not have encouraged myself with this hope. At my first glimpse of his tall, gaunt figure, hard features, and brisk, impatient movements, I knew that my wit and equanimity would be put to their full test in the interview. He was engaged, at my entrance, in some harsh dispute with a couple of other men, but came forward quickly enough when he saw me. Recognizing at once that any attempt at ingratiation would fail with this man, I entered at once upon my errand by asking a question direct enough to command his attention, if it did not insure the desired reply. "Mr. Searles, when you purchased the house on Franklin Street, did you know enough about it to have an answer ready for anyone who might declare it haunted?" The abruptness of the attack produced its effect. Annoyance swept every hint of patience from face and manner, and he exclaimed in a tone which conveyed only too openly how disagreeable the subject was to him. "Again!" I smiled. It would not do to show how much I felt the total lack of sympathy in his manner. "You will have trouble," said I, "until it is proved that the occurrences which have provoked this report have a very natural and quite human source." He stopped in his nervous fidgeting and gave me a quick, hard look. "Who are you?" he asked, "and why has Mrs. Packard made you her messenger instead of coming herself?" "I am her companion, engaged by Mayor Packard to stay with her during his contemplated absence. I am here instead of Mrs. Packard because it is she herself who is the present sufferer from the disagreeable experiences which attend life in the Franklin Street house." "Mrs. Packard?" His tone betrayed a complete incredulity. "Mrs. Packard? A woman of such strong good sense! I think you must have been misled by some foolish attempt at humor on her part. Does she know that you have come to me with this complaint?" "She does not. She's not in a condition to be consulted on the subject. I am Mayor Packard's emissary. He is very anxious about his wife." Then, as Mr. Searles continued unmoved, I added in a straightforward manner and with all the earnestness I felt: "Mrs. Packard believes herself to have come face to face with an undoubted specter in the library of the house they have rented from you. She related the circumstances to her husband and to myself this very morning. It occurred, according to her story, several days ago. Meantime her manner and appearance have shown a great change.
Mayor Packard is not the only one who has noticed it. The whole household has been struck by her condition, though no one knew its cause until today. Of course, we do not believe in the specter. That was pure hallucination on her part. This we no more doubt than you do." "Then what do you want here?" he asked, after a moment of harsh scrutiny. "Proof which will convince her that it was an hallucination and without the least basis in any spiritual fact," I returned. "If you will give me a few minutes of your time, I will explain just what I mean and also make known to you my wishes. I can wait till you have finished your business with the gentleman I see over there." He honored me with a look which for the first time showed any appreciation of my feelings, and pushing open a door near by, called out to some one within: "Here, Robinson, talk with this lady. Her business is not in my line." Then turning to me with a quick "Step in, madam," he left me with the greatest abruptness and hurried back to the gentleman awaiting him on the other side of the room. I was considerably taken aback by this move, but knew no other course than to enter the room he had pointed out and pursue my conversation with whomever I should find there. Alas! The gentleman who rose at my entrance was also one of the tall, thin, and nervous type. But he was not without heart, like the other, as was soon made apparent to me. Very few human faces are plainer than the one I now searched for the encouragement of which I stood in such sore need, but also very few faces, handsome or otherwise, have the attraction of so pleasant a smile. Its affable greeting was followed by the hasty pushing forward of a chair and a kind inquiry as to what he could do for me. My answer woke an immediate interest. "My name is Saunders," I said. "I am at present an inmate of Mayor Packard's house, a house belonging to Mr. Searles, and one which has its drawbacks." The meaning look with which I uttered the last sentence called forth an answering one. A flash of excitement broke over his features, and he cast a quick glance at the door, which fortunately had swung to at my entrance. "Has anything of a disagreeable nature happened to any one in this house?" he asked with ill-concealed perturbation. "I did not expect it during their tenantry, but if such has occurred, I am obliged to Mrs. Packard for letting me know. She promised to, you see, and—" "She promised?" I cried. "Yes. In joke, no doubt, being at the time in a very incredulous state of mind. She vowed that she would let me know the very day she saw the lights or encountered anything in the house which could be construed into a spiritual visitation. Has such a manifestation occurred?" he eagerly inquired. "Has it? Has it? Am I to add her name to the list of those who have found the house uninhabitable?" "That I am not ready to say," was my cautious response. Mrs. Packard, during the period of her husband's candidacy, would scarcely wish to draw public attention to herself or these supernatural happenings by any such move. I hope that what I say to you on this subject will go no further." "You may rest assured that it will never become public property," he assured me. "One person I am bound to tell, but that is all. That person is too much interested in the house's good name to spread so damaging a story. An experience, more or less disagreeable, must have occurred to some member of the family," continued Mr. Robinson. "Your presence here assures me of that. What kind of experience? The manifestations have not always been of the same nature." "No. And that is what so engages my attention. These experiences differ so much in their character. Do you happen to know the exact nature of each? I have a theory which I long to substantiate. May I trust you with it?" "You certainly may, miss. No one has thought over this matter more earnestly than I have. Not because of any superstitious tendency on my part, rather from the lack of it. I don't believe in spirits. I don't believe in supernatural agencies of any kind. Yet strange things do happen in that house, things which we find it hard to explain." Mrs. Packard's experience was this. She believes herself to have encountered in the library the specter of a specter with a gaze so terrifying that it impressed itself upon her as an omen of death or some other dire disaster. What have your other tenants seen?" "Shadows mostly, but not always. Sometimes the outline of an arm projecting out of darkness. Sometimes the trace of steps on the hall floors, or the discovery in the morning of an open door which had been carefully closed at bedtime."
Once it was the trailing of ghostly fingers across the sleeper's face.
And once a succession of groans rising from the lower halls and drawing the whole family from their beds, to find no one but themselves within the whole four walls. A clearly outlined phantom has been scarce. But Mrs. Packard has seen one, you say?" "Thinks she has seen one," I corrected. "Mayor Packard and myself both look upon the occurrence as a wholly imaginary one, caused by her secret brooding over the very manifestations you mention. If she could be convinced that these manifestations had a physical origin, she would immediately question the reality of the specter she now believes herself to have seen. To bring her to this point, I am ready to exert myself to the utmost. Are you willing to do the same? If so, I can assure you of Mayor Packard's appreciation." "How? What? You believe the whole thing a fraud? That all these tenants coming from various quarters manufactured all these stories and submitted to endless inconvenience to perpetuate a senseless lie?" "No, I don't think that. The tenants were honest enough, but who owned the house before Mr. Searles?" I was resolved to give no hint of the information imparted to me by Mrs. Packard. "The Misses Quinlan, the two maiden ladies who live next door to Mayor Packard." "I don't know them," said I truthfully. "Very worthy women," Mr. Robinson assured me. "They are as much disturbed and as completely puzzled as the rest of us over the mysterious visitations which have lessened the value of their former property. They have asked me more than once for an explanation of its marked unpopularity. I felt foolish to say ghosts, but finally I found myself forced to do so, much to my lasting regret." "How? Why?" I asked, with all the force of a very rapidly increasing curiosity. "Because its effect upon them has been so disastrous. They were women of intelligence previous to this, one of them quite markedly so. But from that day they have given evidence of mental weakness which can only be attributed to their continual brooding over this mysterious topic. The house, whose peculiarities we are now discussing, was once their family homestead, and they shrink from the reproach of its unfortunate reputation. What, you don't think so?" he impetuously asked, moved perhaps by my suggestive silence. "You are suspicious of these two poor old women? What reason have you for that, Miss Saunders? What motive could they have for depreciating the value of what was once their own property?" So he knew nothing of the lost bonds. Mrs. Packard had made no mistake when she assured me of the secrecy with which they had endured their misfortune. It gave me great relief. I could work more safely with this secret unshared. But the situation called for dissimulation. It was with anything but real openness that I declared: "You cannot calculate the impulses of an affected mind. Jealousy of the past may influence these unfortunate women. They possibly hate to see strangers in the rooms made sacred by old associations." "That is possible. But how could they, shut up in a house separated from yours by a distance of several feet, be held accountable for the phenomena observed in 393? There are no means of communication between the two buildings. Even the doors which once faced each other across the dividing alley have been closed up. Interference from them is impossible." "No more impossible than from any other outside source. Is it a fact that the doors and windows of this strangely haunted house were always found securely locked after each occurrence of the phenomena you have mentioned?" "So I have been told by every tenant I have questioned, and I was careful to question them, I assure you." "That settles the matter in my mind," I asserted. "These women know of some means of entrance that has escaped general discovery. Cunning is a common attribute of the unsettled brain." "And they are very cunning. Miss Saunders, you have put a totally new idea into my head. I do not place much stress upon the motive you have attributed to them, nor do I see how the appearances noted could have been produced by these two antiquated women. But the interest they have displayed in the effect these have had upon others has been of the most decided nature. They have called here after the departure of every fresh tenant, and it was all that I could do to answer their persistent inquiries. It is to them and not to Mr. Searles I feel bound to report the apparition seen by Mrs. Packard." "To them!" I ejaculated in amazement. "Why to them? They no longer have a proprietary interest in the house." "Very true. but they long ago exacted a promise from me to keep a strict account of such complaints as were raised against the house. They, in short, paid me to do so. From time to time they have come here to read this account. It annoys Mr. Searles, but I have had considerable patience with them for reasons which your kind heart will instantly suggest." I thought of the real pathos of the situation, and how much I might increase his interest by giving him the full details of their pitiful history, and the maddening hopes it engendered of a possible discovery of the treasure they still believed to be hidden in the house. What I said, however, was this: "You have kept an account, you say, of the varied phenomena seen in this house. You have that account now?" "Yes, Miss Saunders." "Let us look it over together. Let us see if it does not give us some clue to the mystery puzzling us." He eyed me doubtfully, or as much so as his great nature would allow. Meantime I gauged my man. Was he to be thoroughly and unequivocally trusted? His very hesitation in face of his undoubted sympathy with me seemed to insure that he was. At all events, the occasion warranted some risk on my part. At least I persuaded myself that it did, so without waiting for his reply, I earnestly remarked: "The matter is more serious than you suppose. If the mayor were not unavoidably called away by his political obligations, he would add his entreaties to mine for a complete sifting of this whole affair. The Misses Quinlan may very well be innocent of inciting these manifestations. If so, we can do them no harm by a little confidential consideration of the affair from the standpoint I have given you. If they are not, then Mr. Searles and Mayor Packard should know it." It appeared to convince him. His homely face shone with the fire of sudden interest and resolve, and reaching for a small drawer at the right of his desk, he opened it and drew forth a folded paper, which he proceeded to open before me with the remark: "Here is a report that I have kept for my own satisfaction. I do not feel that in showing it to you I am violating any trust reposed in me by the Misses Quinlan. I never promised secrecy in the matter." I glanced at the paper, all eagerness. He smiled and pushed it toward me. This is what I read: "First tenant, Mr. Hugh Dennison and family. Night 1. Heard and saw nothing. Night 2. The entire household wakened by a scream seemingly coming from below. This was twice repeated before Mr. Dennison could reach the hall, the last time in far distant and smothered tones. Investigation revealed nothing. No person and no trace of any persons, save themselves, could be found anywhere in the house. Uncomfortable feelings, but no alarm as yet. Night 3. No screams, but a sound of groaning in the library. The tall clock standing near the drawing room door stopped at 12, and a door was found open which Mr. Dennison is sure he shut tight on retiring. A second unavailing search. One servant left the next morning. Night 4. Footfalls on the stairs. The library door, locked by Mr. Dennison's own hand, is heard to unclose. The timepiece on the library mantel shelf strikes 12, but it is slightly fast, and Mr. and Mrs. Dennison, who have crept from their room to the stairhead, listen breathlessly for the deep boom of the great hall clock, the one which had stopped the night before. No light is burning anywhere, and the hall below is a pit of darkness, when suddenly Mrs. Dennison seizes her husband's arm and, gasping out, "The clock! The clock!" falls fainting to the floor. He bends to look, and faintly, in the heart of the shadows, he catches in dim outline the face of the clock, and reaching up to it a spectral hand. Nothing else, and in another moment that too disappears, but the silence is something awful. The great clock has stopped. With a shout he stumbles downward, lights up the hall, lights up the rooms, but finds nothing and no one. Next morning the second servant leaves, but her place is soon supplied by an applicant we will call Bess. Night 5. Mrs. Dennison sleeps at a hotel with the children. Mr. Dennison, revolver in hand, keeps watch on the haunted stairway. He has fastened up every door and shutter with his own hand, and with equal care extinguished all lights. As the hour of 12 approaches, he listens breathlessly. There is certainly a stir somewhere, but he cannot locate it, not quite satisfy himself whether it is a footfall or a rustle that he hears. The clock in the library strikes 12. Then the one in the hall gives one great boom and stops. Instantly he raises his revolver and shoots directly at its face. No sound from human lips answers the discharge of the weapon. In the flash which for a moment has lighted up the whole place, he catches one glimpse of the broken dial with its two hands pointing directly at 12, but nothing more. Then all is dark again, and he goes slowly back to his own room. The next day he threw up his lease. Second tenant, Mrs. Crispin. Stayed but one night. Would never tell us what she saw. Third tenant, Mrs. Southwick. Hires Bess for maid of all work, the only girl she could get. Night 1. Unearthly lights shining up through the house, waking the family. Disappeared as one and all came creeping out into the hall. Night 2. The same, followed by deep groans. Children waked and shrieked. Night 3. Nothing. Night 4. Lights, groans, and strange shadows on the walls and ceilings of the various hallways. Family gave notice the next day, but do not leave for a week owing to sickness. No manifestations while doctor and nurses are in the house. House stands vacant for 3 months. Bess offers to remain in it as caretaker, but her offer is refused. Police investigate. An amusing farce. One of them saw something and could not be laughed out of it by his fellows. But the general report was unsatisfactory. The mistake was the employment of Irishmen in a task involving superstition. Fourth tenant, Mr. Weston and family. Remained 3 weeks. Leave suddenly because the nurse encountered something moving about in the lower hall one night when she went down to the kitchen to procure hot water for a sick child. Bess again offered her services, but the family would not stay under any circumstances. Another long period without tenant. Mr. Searles tries a night in the empty house, sits and dozes in library till 2, wakes suddenly. Door he has tightly shut is standing open. He feels the draught. Turns on light from dark lantern. Something is there, a shape, he cannot otherwise describe it. As he stares at it, it vanishes through doorway. He rushes for it, finds nothing. The hall is empty. So is the whole house. This finished the report. So Mr. Searles has had his own experiences of these mysteries, I exclaimed. As you see. Perhaps that is why he's so touchy on the subject. Did he ever give you any fuller account of his experience than is detailed here? No, he won't talk about it. He tried to let the house, however. Yes, but he did not succeed for a long time. Finally, the mayor took it. Refolding the paper, I handed it back to Mr. Robinson. I had its contents well in mind. There is one fact to which I should like to call your attention, said I. The manifestations, as here recorded, have all taken place in the lower part of the house. I should have had more faith in them if they had occurred above stairs. There are no outlets through the roof. Nor any visible ones below. At least no visible one was ever found open. What about the woman, Bess? I asked. How do you account for her persistency in clinging to a place her employers invariably fled from? She seems to have been always on hand with an offer of her services. Bess is not a young woman, but she is a worker of uncommon ability, very rigid and very stoical. She herself accounts for her willingness to work in this house by her utter disbelief in spirits, and the fact that it is the one place in the world which connects her with her wandering and worthless husband. Their final parting occurred during Mr. Dennison's tenancy, and as she had given the wanderer the Franklin Street address, you could not reason her out of the belief that on his return he would expect to find her there. That is what she explained to Mr. Searles. You interest me, Mr. Robinson. Is she a plain woman? Such a one as a man would not be likely to return to? No, she is a very good-looking woman, refined and full of character, but odd. Very odd, in fact, baffling. How baffling? I never knew her to look anyone directly in the eye. Her manner is abstracted and inspires distrust. There is also a marked incongruity between her employment and her general appearance. She looks out of place in her working apron, yet she is not what you would call a lady. Did her husband come back? No, not to my knowledge. And where is she now? Very near you, Miss Saunders, when you are at your home in Franklin Street. Not being able to obtain a situation in the house itself, she has rented the little shop opposite, where you can find her any day selling needles and thread." "I have noticed that shop," I admitted, not knowing whether to give more or less weight to my suspicions in thus finding the mayor's house under the continued gaze of another watchful eye. "You will find two women there," the amiable Mr. Robinson hastened to explain. "The one with a dark red spot just under her hair is Bess. But perhaps she doesn't interest you. She always has me. If it had not been for one fact, I should have suspected her of having been in some way connected with the strange doings we have just been considering. She was not a member of the household during the occupancy of Mrs. Crispin and the Westons, yet these unusual manifestations went on just the same." "Yes, I noted that. So her connivance is eliminated." "Undoubtedly. I am still disposed to credit the Misses Quinlan with the whole ridiculous business. They could not bear to see strangers in the house they had once called their own, and took the only means suggested to their crazy old minds to rid the place of them." Mr. Robinson shook his head, evidently unconvinced. The temptation was great to strengthen my side of the argument by a revelation of their real motive. Once acquainted with the story of the missing bonds, he could not fail to see the extreme probability that the two sisters, afflicted as they were with dementia, should wish to protect the wealth which was once so near their grasp from the possibility of discovery by a stranger. But I dared not take him quite yet into my full confidence. Indeed, the situation did not demand it. I had learned from him what I was most anxious to know, and was now in a position to forward my own projects without further aid from him. Almost as if he had read my thoughts, Mr. Robinson now hastened to remark: "I find it difficult to credit these poor old souls with any such elaborate plan to empty the house, even had they possessed the most direct means of doing so, for no better reason than this one you state. Had money been somehow involved, or had they even thought so, it would be different. They are a little touched in the head on the subject of money, which isn't very strange considering their present straits. They even show an interest in other people's money. They have asked me more than once if any of their former neighbors have seemed to grow more prosperous since leaving Franklin Street." "I see. Touched, touched," I laughed, rising in my anxiety to hide any show of feeling at the directness of this purely accidental attack. But the item struck me as an important one. Mr. Robinson gave me a keen look as I uttered the usual commonplaces and prepared to take my leave. "May I ask your intentions in this matter?" said he. "I wish I knew them myself," was my perfectly candid answer. "It strikes me now that my first step should be to ascertain whether there exists any secret connection between the two houses which would enable the Misses Quinlan or their emissaries to gain access to their old home without ready detection. I know of none, and—" "There is none," broke in its now emphatic agent. "A half dozen tenants, to say nothing of Mr. Searles himself, have looked it carefully over. All the walls are intact. There is absolutely no opening anywhere for surreptitious access." "Possibly not. You certainly discourage me very much. I had hoped much from my theory. But we are not done with the matter. Mrs. Packard's mind must be cleared of its fancies, if it is in my power to do it. You will hear from me again, Mr. Robinson. Meanwhile I may be sure of your good will?" "Certainly, certainly, and of my cooperation also, if you want it." "Thank you," said I, and left the office. His last look was one of interest not untinged by compassion. End of chapter 10. Recording by Lois Hill, Kamiah, Idaho.
Of the Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Monica Rowley. The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green. On my way back, I took the opposite side of the street from that I usually approached. When I reached a little shop I paused. First, glancing at the various petty articles exposed in the window, I quietly stepped in. A contracted and very low room met my eyes, faintly lighted by a row of panes in the upper half of the door, and not at all by the window, which was hung on the inside with a heavy curtain. Against two sides of this room were ranged shelves, filled with boxes labeled in the usual way to indicate their contents. These did not strike me as being very varied or of a very high order. There was no counter in front, only some tables on which lay strewn fancy boxes of thread and other useless knickknacks to which certain shopkeepers appear to cling, though they can seldom find customers for them. A woman stood at one of these tables untangling a skein of red yarn. Behind her I saw another leaning in an abstracted way over a counter which ran from wall to wall across the extreme end of the shop. This I took to be Bess. She made no move at my entrance, and she made no move now. The woman with the skein appeared, on the contrary, as eager to see as the other seemed indifferent. I had to buy something, and I did so in as matter-of-fact a way as possible, considering that my attention was more given to the woman in the rear than to the articles I was purchasing. "You have a very convenient place here," I casually remarked as I handed out my money. With this I turned squarely about and looked directly at her whom I believed to be Bess. A voluble answer from the woman at my side, but not a wink of an eye from the one whose attention I had endeavored to attract. "I live in the house opposite," I carelessly went on, taking in every detail of the strange being I was secretly addressing. "Oh!" she exclaimed in startled tones, roused into speech at last. "You live opposite in Mayor Packard's house?" I approached her, smiling. She had dropped her hands from her chin and seemed very eager now, more eager than the other woman, to interest me in what she had about her and so hold me to the shop. "Look at this!" she cried, holding up an article of such cheap workmanship that I wondered so sensible an appearing woman would cumber her shelves with it. "I'm glad you live over there," for I had nodded to her question. "I'm greatly interested in that house. I've worked there as a cook and waitress several times." I met her look. It was sharp and very intelligent. "Then you know its reputation," I laughingly suggested. She made a contemptuous gesture. The woman was really very good looking, but baffling in her manner, as Mr. Robertson had said, and very hard to classify. "That isn't what interests me," she protested. "I've other reasons. You're not a relative of the family, are you?" she asked impetuously, leaning over the table to get a nearer view of my face. "No, nor even a friend. I am in their employ just now as a companion to Mrs. Packard. Her health is not very good, and the mayor is away a great deal. I thought you didn't belong here. I know all who belong here. I've little else to do but stare across the street," she added apologetically and with a deep flush. "Business is very poor in this shop." I was standing directly in front of her. Turning quickly about, I looked through the narrow panes of the door and found that my eyes naturally rested on the stoop of the opposite house. Indeed, this stoop was about all that could be seen from the spot where this woman stood. "Another Eve bent in constant watchfulness upon us," I inwardly commented. "We are quite surrounded. The house should certainly hold treasure to warrant all this interest. But what could this one-time domestic know of the missing bonds?" "An old-fashioned doorway," I remarked. "It is the only one of the kind in the whole street. It makes the house conspicuous, but in a way I like. I don't wonder you enjoy looking at it. To me such a house and such a doorway suggest mystery and a romantic past. If the place is not haunted and only a fool believes in ghosts, something strange must have happened there, or I should never have the nervous feeling I have in going about the halls and up and down the stairways. Do you never have that feeling?" "Never. I'm not given to feelings. I live one day after another and just wait." "Not given to feelings? With such eyes in such a face?" You should have looked down when you said that, Bess. I might have believed you then." "Wait," I softly repeated. "Wait for what? For fortune to enter your little shop door?" "No, for my husband to come back," was the unexpected answer, uttered grimly enough to have frightened that husband away again, had he been fortunate or unfortunate enough to hear her. "I'm a married woman, miss, and shouldn't be working like this. And I won't be always. My man'll come back and make a lady of me again. It's that I'm waiting for." Here a customer came in. Naturally I drew back, for our faces were nearly touching. "Don't go," she pleaded, catching me by the sleeve and turning astonishingly pale for one ordinarily so ruddy. "I want to ask a favor of you. Come into my little room behind. You won't regret it." This last in an emphatic whisper. Amazed at the turn which the conversation had taken, and congratulating myself greatly upon my success in ensuring her immediate confidence, I slipped through the opening she made for me between the tables serving for a counter, and followed her into a room at the rear, which, from its appearance, answered the triple purpose of sleeping room, parlor, and kitchen. "Pardon my impertinence," said she as she carefully closed the door behind us. "It's not my habit to make friends with strangers, but I've taken a fancy to you and think you can be trusted. Will—" she hesitated and burst out, "will you do something for me?" "If I can," I smiled. "How long do you expect to stay over there?" "Oh, that I can't say. A month? A week?" "Probably a week." "Then you can do what I want, Miss Saunders," I put in. "There is something in that house which belongs to me." I started. This was hardly what I expected her to say. "Something of great importance to me, something which I must have and have very soon. I don't want to go there for it myself. I hid in a very safe place one day when my future looked doubtful, and I didn't know where I might be going or what might happen to me. Mrs. Packard would think it strange if she saw where, and might make it very uncomfortable for me, but you can get what I want without trouble if you are not afraid of going about the house at night. It's a little box with my name on it, and it is hidden." "Where?" "Behind a brick I loosened in the cellar wall. I can describe the very place. Oh, you think I'm asking too much of you, a stranger and a lady. No, I'm willing to do what I can for you, but I think you ought to tell me what's in the box so that I shall know exactly what I'm doing." "I can't tell. I do not dare to tell till I have it again in my own hand. Then we will look it over together. Do you hesitate? You needn't. No inconvenience will follow to anyone if you are careful to rely on yourself and not let any other person see or handle this box." "How large is it?" I asked, quite as breathless as herself, as I realized the possibilities underlying this remarkable request. "It is so small that you can conceal it under an apron or in the pocket of your coat. In exchange for it I will give you all I can afford, $10. "No more than that?" I asked, testing her. "No more at first. Afterwards, if it brings me what it ought to, I will give you whatever you think it is worth. Does that satisfy you? Are you willing to risk an encounter with the ghost for just $10 and a promise?" The smile with which she said this was indescribable. I think it gave me a more thrilling consciousness of human terror in face of the supernatural than anything which I had yet heard in this connection. Surely her motive for remaining in the haunted house had been extraordinarily strong. "You are afraid," she declared. "You will shrink when the time comes from going into that cellar at night." I shook my head. I had already regained both my will power and the resolution to carry out this adventure to the end. "I will go," said I. "And get me my box?" "Yes." "And bring it to me here as early the next day as you can leave Mrs. Packard?" "Yes." "Oh, you don't know what this means to me." I had a suspicion, but held my peace and let her rhapsodize. No one in all my life has ever shown me so much kindness. Are you sure you won't be tempted to tell anyone what you mean to do?" "Quite sure." "And will you go down into the cellar and get this box for me all by yourself?" "Yes, if you demand it." "I do. You will see why some day." "Very well, you can trust me. Now tell me where I am to find the brick you designate." "It's in the cellar wall, about halfway down on the right-hand side. You will see nothing but stone for a foot or two above the floor, but after that comes the brick wall. On one of these bricks you will detect a cross scratched. That's the one. It will look as well cemented as the rest, but if you throw water against it, you will find that in a little while you will be able to pry it out. Take something to do this with, a knife or a pair of scissors. When the brick falls out, feel behind with your hand and you will find the box. A questionable task. What if I should be seen at it? The ghost will protect you." Again that smile of mingled sarcasm and innuendo. It was no common servant girl's smile, and more than her language was that of the ignorant domestic. "I believe the ghost fails to walk since the present tenants came into the house," I remarked, "but its reputation remains. You will not be disturbed." "Possibly not. A good reason why you might safely undertake this business yourself. I can find some way of letting you in." No, I shall never again cross that threshold." Her whole attitude showed revolt and bitter determination. "Yet you have never been frightened by anything there?" "I know, but I have suffered. That is for one who has no feelings. The box will have to remain in its place undisturbed if you won't get it for me." "Positively?" "Yes, miss. Nothing would induce me even to cross the street." "But I want the box." "You shall have it," said I. End of chapter 11. Recording by Monica Rowley. Of the Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Monica Rowley. The Mayor's Wife by Katharine Green. Chapter 12. I seemed bound to be the prey of a divided duty. As I crossed the street, I asked myself which of the two experiments I had in mind should occupy my attention first. Should I proceed at once with that close study and detailed examination of the house which I contemplated in my eagerness to establish my theory of a secret passage between it and the one now inhabited by the Misses Quinlan, or should I wait to do this until I had recovered the box, which might hold still greater secrets? I could not decide, so I resolved to be guided by circumstances. If Mrs. Packard was still out, I did not think I could sit down till I had a complete plan of the house as a start in the inquiry which interested me most. Mrs. Packard was still out, so much Nixon deigned to tell me in answer to my question. Whether the fact displeased him or not, I could not say, but he was looking very sour and seemed to resent the trouble he had been to in opening the door for me. Should I notice this, even by an attempt to conciliate him? I decided not. A natural manner was the best. He was too keen not to notice and give his own interpretation, too uncalled for smiles or words which contrasted too strongly with his own marked reticence. I therefore said nothing as he pottered slowly back into his own quarters in the rear, but lingered about downstairs till I was quite sure he was out of sight and hearing. Then I came back and took up my point of view on the spot where the big hall clock had stood in the days of Mr. Dennison. Later I made a drawing of this floor as it must have looked at that time. You will find it on the opposite page. Transcriber's note: the plan shows the house to have 2 rows of rooms with a hall between. In the front each room ends in a bow window. On the right, the drawing room has 2 doors opening into the hall, equally spaced near the front and rear of the room. Across the hall are 2 rooms of apparently equal size, a reception room in front and the library behind it, both rooms having windows facing on the alley. There is a stairway in the hall just behind the door to the reception room. The study is behind the drawing room. Opposite this is a side hall and the dining room. The library and dining room both open off this hall, with the dining room also having doors to the main hall and kitchen. The side hall ends with a stoop in the alley. A small room labeled kitchen, etc., lies behind the dining room, and the hall extends beyond the study, beside the kitchen, with the cellar stairs on the kitchen side. There is a small rectangle in the hall about 2/3 of the way down the side of the drawing room, which is labeled A. Near the place where I stood, marked A on the plan, had occurred most of the phenomena which could be located at all. Here the spectral hand had been seen stopping the clock. Here the shape had passed encountered by Mr. Weston's cook, and just a few steps beyond, where the library door opened under the stairs, Mr. Seals had seen the flitting figure which had shut his mouth on the subject of his tenant's universal folly. From the front, then, toward the back, these manifestations had invariably peeped to disappear. Where? That was what I was to determine, what I am sure Mayor Packard would wish me to determine, if he knew the whole situation as I knew it from his wife's story and the record I had just read at the agent's office. Alas, there were many points of exit from this portion of the hall. The drawing room opened near, so did Mayor Packard's study. Then there was the kitchen, with its various offices, ending, as I knew, in the cellar stairs. Nearer, I could see the door leading into the dining room, and, opening closer yet, the short side hall, running down to what had once been the shallow vestibule of a small side entrance, but which, as I had noted many times in passing to and from the dining room, was now used as a recess or alcove to hold a cabinet of Indian curios. In which of these directions should I carry my inquiry? All looked equally unpromising, unless it was Mayor Packard's study, and that no one, with the exception of Mr. Steele, ever entered save by his invitation, not even his wife. I could not hope to cross that threshold, nor did I greatly desire to invade the kitchen, especially while Nixon was there. Should I have to wait till the mayor's return for the cooperation of tasks certainly demanded? It looked that way, but before yielding to the discouragement following this thought, I glanced about me again and suddenly remembered, first, the creaking board which had once answered the so-called spirit's flight, and secondly, the fact, which common sense would have suggested before, that if my theory were true, and the secret presence, whose coming and going I had been considering, had fled by some secret passage leading to the neighboring house, then by all laws of convenience and natural property, that passage should open from the side facing the Quinlan domicile, and not from that holding Mayor Packard's study and the remote drawing room. This considerably narrowed my field of inquiry, and made me immediately anxious to find that creaking board, which promised to narrow it further yet. Where should I seek it? In these rear halls, of course, but I hated to be caught pacing them at this hour. Nixon's step had not roused it, or I should have noticed it, for I was, in a way, listening for this very sound. It was not in the direct path, then, from the front door to the kitchen. Was it on one side, or in the space about the dining room door, or where the transverse corridor met the main hall? All these floors were covered, in the old-fashioned way, with carpet, which would seem to show that no new boards had been laid and that the creaking one should still be there. I ventured to go as far as the transverse hall. I was at full liberty to enter the library, but no result followed this experiment. My footsteps had never fallen more noiselessly. Where could the board be? In aimless uncertainty I stepped into the corridor, and instantly a creak woke under my foot. I had located the direction in which one of the so-called phantoms had fled. It was down this transverse hall. Flushed with apparent success, I looked up at the walls on either side of me. They were gray with paint and presented one unbroken surface from baseboard to ceiling, save where the two doorways opened, one into the library, the other into the dining room. Had the flying presence escaped by either of these two rooms? I knew the dining room well. I had had several opportunities for studying its details. I thought I knew the library. Besides, Mr. Searles had been in the library when the shape advanced upon him from the hall, a fact eliminating that room as a possible source of approach. What then was left? The recess which had once served as an old-time entrance. That gave promise of something. It projected directly toward where the adjacent walls had once held two doors, between which any sort of mischief might take place. Say that the Misses Quinlan had retained certain keys. What easier than for one of them to enter the outer door, strike a light, open the inner one, and flash this light up through the house till steps or voices warned her of an aroused family, when she had only to reclose the inside door, put out the light, and escape by the outer one. But alas, at this point I remembered that this, as well as all other outside doors, had invariably been protected by bolt, and that these bolts had never been found disturbed. Verily, I was busying myself for nothing over this old vestibule. Yet before I left it I gave it another glance, satisfied myself that its walls were solid, in fact, built of brick like the house. This on two sides. The door occupied a third and showed the same unbroken coat of thick old paint, its surface barely hidden by the cabinet placed at right angles to it. Enough of it, however, remained exposed to view to give me an opportunity of admiring its sturdy panels and its old-fashioned look. The door was further secured by heavy pivoted bars extending from jamb to jamb. An egg and dart moulding extended all around the casing where the inner door had once hung. All solid, all very old-fashioned, but totally unsuggestive of any reasonable solution of the mystery. I had vaguely hoped it to explain. Was I mistaken in my theory? And must I look elsewhere for what I still honestly expected to find? Undoubtedly. And with this decision I turned to leave the recess, when a sensation of too peculiar a nature for me readily to understand it caused me to stop short and look down at my feet in an inquiring way, and afterward to lift the rug on which I had been standing and take a look at the floor underneath. It was covered with carpet like the rest of the hall, but this did not disguise the fact that it sloped a trifle toward the outside wall. Had not the idea been preposterous, I should have said that the weight of the cabinet had been too much for it, causing it to sag quite perceptibly at the baseboard. But this seemed too improbable to consider. Old as the house was, it was not old enough for its beams to have rolled. Yet the floor was certainly uneven, and, what was stranger yet, had, in sagging, failed to carry the baseboard with it. This I could see by peering around the side of the cabinet. Was it an important enough fact to call for explanation? Possibly not. Yet when I had taken a short leap up and come down on what was certainly an unstable floor, I decided that I should never be satisfied till I had seen that cabinet removed and the floor under it rigidly examined. Yet when I came to take a look at this projection from the library window and saw that this floor, like that of the many entrances, was only the height of one step from the ground, I felt the folly into which my inquiring spirit had led me, and would have dismissed the whole subject from my mind if my eyes had not detected at that moment on one of the tables an unusually thin paper knife. This gave me an idea. Carrying it back with me into the recess, I got down on my knees, and first taking the precaution to toss a little stick pin of mine under the cabinet to be reached after in case I was detected there by Nixon, I insinuated the cutter between the baseboard and the floor, and found that I could not only push it in an inch or more before striking the brick, but run it quite freely around from one corner of the recess to the other. This was surely surprising. The exterior of this vestibule must be considerably larger than the interior would denote. What occupied the space between? I went upstairs full of thought. Some time, and that before long, I would have that cabinet removed. End of chapter 12. Recording by Monica Rowley. Of The Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Monica Rowley. The Mayor's Wife by Katharine Green. Chapter 13. Mrs. Packard came in very soon after this. She was accompanied by two friends, and I could hear them talking and laughing in her room upstairs all afternoon. It gave me leisure, but leisure was not what I stood in need of just now. I desired much more an opportunity to pursue my inquiries, for I knew why she had brought these friends home with her and lent herself to a merriment that was not natural to her. She wished to forestall thought, to keep down dread, to fill the house so full of cheer that no whisper could reach her from that spirit world she had come to fear. She had seen, or believed that she had seen, a spectre, and she had certainly heard a laugh that had come from no explicable human source. The brightness of the sunshiny day aided her unconsciously in this endeavor, but I foresaw the moment when this brightness would disappear and her friends say good-bye. Then the shadows must fall again more heavily than ever because of their transient lifting. I almost wished she had indeed gone with her husband, and found myself wondering why he had not asked her to do so when he found what it was that depressed her. Perhaps he had, and it was she who had held back. She may have made up her mind to conquer this weakness, and to conquer it where it had originated and necessarily held the strongest sway. At all events, he was gone and she was here, and I had done nothing as yet to relieve that insidious dread with which she must anticipate a night in this house without his presence. I wondered if it would be any relief to her to have Mr. Steele remain upon the premises. I had heard him come in about 3 o'clock and go into the study, and when the time came for her friends to take their leave, and their voices in merry chatter came up to my ear from the open boudoir door, I stole down to ask her if I could suggest it to him. But I was too late. Just as I reached the head of the stairs on the second floor, he came out of the study below and passed, hat in hand, toward the front door. "What a handsome man!" came in an audible whisper from one of the ladies who now stood in the lower hall. "Who is he?" asked the other. I thought he held the door open 1 minute longer than was necessary to catch her reply. It was a very cold and unenthusiastic one. "That is Mr. Packard's secretary," said she. "He will join the mayor just as soon as he has finished certain preparations entrusted to him." "Oh," was their quiet rejoinder, but a note of disappointment rang in both voices as the door shut behind him. "One does not often see a perfectly handsome man." I stepped down to meet her when she in turn had shut the door upon them, but I stopped halfway. She was standing with her head turned away from me and the knob still in her hand. I saw that she was thinking or was the prey of some rapidly growing resolve. Suddenly she seized the key and turned it. "The house is closed for the night," she announced as she looked up and met my astonished gaze. "No one goes out or comes in here again till morning. I have seen all the visitors I have strength for." And though she did not know I saw it, she withdrew the key and slipped it into her pocket. "This is Nixon's night out," she murmured as she led the way to the library. "Ellen will wait on us and we'll have the baby down and play games and be as merry as ever we can be to keep the ghosts away," she cried in fresh, defiant tones that had just the faintest suggestion of hysteria in them. "We shall succeed. I don't mean to think of it again. I'm right in that, am I not? You look as if you thought so. Ah, Mr. Packard was kind to secure me such a companion. I must prove my gratitude to him by keeping you close to me. It was a mistake to have those light-headed women visit me today. They tired more than they comforted me." I smiled and put the question which concerned me most nearly. "Does Nixon stay late when he goes out?" She threw herself into a chair and took up her embroidery. "He will tonight," was her answer. "A little grandniece of his is coming on a late train from Pittsburgh. I don't think the train is due till midnight, and after that he's got to take her to his daughter's on Carey Street. It will be 1 o'clock at least before he can be back." I hid my satisfaction. Fate was truly auspicious. I would make good use of his absence. There was nobody else in the house whose surveillance I feared. "Pray send for the baby now," I exclaimed. "I am eager to begin our merry evening." She smiled and rang the bell for Letty, the nurse. Late that night I left my room and stole softly downstairs. Mrs. Packard had ordered a bed made up for herself in the nursery and had retired early. So had Ellen and Letty. The house was therefore clear below stairs, and after I had passed the second story I felt myself removed from all human presence, as though I were alone in the house. This was a relief to me, yet the experience was not a happy one. Ellen had asked permission to leave the light burning in the hall during the mayor's absence, so the way was plain enough for me, but no parlor floor looks inviting after 12 o'clock at night, and this one held a secret as yet unsolved, which did not add to its comfort or take the mysterious threat from the shadows lurking in corners and under stairways which I had to pass. As I hurried past the place where the clock had once stood, I thought of the nurse's story and of the many frightened hearts which had throbbed on the stairway I had just left and between the walls. I was fast approaching, but I did not turn back. That would have been an acknowledgment of the truth of what I was at this very time exerting my full faculties to disprove. I knew little about the rear of the house and nothing about the cellar, but when I had found my way into the kitchen and lit the candle I had brought from my room, I had no difficulty in deciding which of the many doors led below. There is something about a cellar door which is unmistakable, but it took me a minute to summon up courage to open it after I had laid my hand on its old-fashioned latch. Why do we so hate darkness and the chill of unknown regions, even when we know they are empty of all that can hurt or really frighten us? I was as safe there as in my bed upstairs, yet I had to force myself to consider more than once the importance of my errand and the positive result it might have in allaying the disturbance in more than one mind before I could lift that latch and set my foot on the short flight which led into the yawning blackness beneath me. But once on the way I took courage. I pictured to myself the collection of useful articles with which the spaces before me were naturally filled, and thought how harmless were the sources of the grotesque shadows which bowed to me from every side and even from the cement floor toward the one spot where the stones of the foundation showed themselves clear of all encumbering objects. As I saw how numerous these articles were, and how small a portion of the wall itself was really visible, I had my first practical fear, and a practical fear soon puts imaginary ones to flight. What if some huge box or case of bottles should have been piled up in front of the market brick I was seeking? I am strong, but I could not move such an object alone, and this search was a solitary one. I had been forbidden to seek help. The anxiety this possibility involved nerved me to instant action. I leapt forward to the one clear spot singled out for me by chance and began a hurried scrutiny of the short strip of wall which was all that was revealed to me on the right-hand side. Did it hold the marked brick? My little candle shook with eagerness, and it was with difficulty I could see the face of the brick close enough to determine. But fortune favored, and presently my eye fell on one whose surface showed a ruder scratched cross. It was in the lowest row and well within reach of my hand. If I could move it, the box would soon be in my possession, and what might that box not contain? Looking about, I found the furnace and soon the gas jet, which made attendance upon it possible. This lit, I could set my candle down and yet see plainly enough to work. I had shears in my pocket. I have had a man's training in the handling of tools and felt quite confident that I could pry this brick out of it was as easily loosened as Bess had given me to understand. My first thrust in the dusty cement enclosing it encouraged me greatly. It was very friable and so shallow that my scissors' point picked it at once. In 5 minutes' time the brick was clear, so that I easily lifted it out and set it on the floor. The small black hole which was left large enough to admit my hand. I wasted no time thrusting it in, expecting to feel the box at once and draw it out, but it was farther back than I expected, and while I was feeling about something gave away and fell with a slight rustling noise down out of my reach. Was it the box? No, for in another instant I had come in contact with its broken edges and had drawn it out. The falling object must have been some extra mortar, and it had gone where? I did not stop to consider then. The object in my hand was too alluring, the size, the shape too suggestive of a package of folded bonds for me to think of anything but the satisfaction of my curiosity and the consequent clearing of a very serious mystery. Just at this moment, one of intense excitement, I heard, or thought I heard, a stealthy step behind me. Forcing myself to calmness, however, I turned and, holding the candle high, convinced myself that I was alone in the cellar. Carrying the box nearer the light, I pulled off its already loosened string and lifted the cover. In doing this, I suffered from no qualms of conscience. My duty seemed very clear to me, and the end, a totally impersonal one, more than justified the means. A folded paper met my eyes, one not of the kind I expected, then some letters whose address I caught at a glance. Elizabeth Brainard. A discovery which might have stayed my hand at another time, but nothing could stay it now. I opened the paper and looked at it. Alas, it was only her marriage certificate. I had taken all this trouble and all this risk only to rescue for her the proof of her union with one John Silverthorne Brainard. The same name was on her letters. Why had Bess so strongly insisted on a secret search, and why had she concealed her license in so strange a place? Greatly sobered, I restored the paper to its place in the box, slipped on the string, and prepared to leave the cellar with it. Then I remembered the brick on the floor and the open hole where it had been, and afterward the something which had fallen over within, and what this space might mean in a seemingly solid wall. More excited now even than I had been at any time before, I thrust my hand in again and tried to sound the depth of this unexpected, far-reaching hole, but the size of my arm stood in the way of my experiment, and, drawing out my hand, I looked about for a stick and, finding one, plunged that in. To my surprise and growing satisfaction, it went in its full length, about 3 feet. There was a cavity on the other side of this wall of very sizable dimensions. Had I struck the suspected passage? I had great hope of it. Nothing else would account for so large a space on the other side of a wall which gave every indication of being one with the foundation. Catching up my stick, I made a rude estimate of its location, which, after I replaced the brick, put out the gas, and caught up Beth's box. Trembling and more frightened now than at my descent at my own football and tremulous pursuing shadow, I went upstairs. As I passed the corridor leading to the converted vestibule, which had so excited my interest in the afternoon, I paused and made a hurried calculation. If the stick had been 3 feet long, as I judged, and my stride was 30 inches, then the place of that hole in the wall below was directly in a line with where I now stood. In other words, on the vestibule floor, as I had already suspected. How was I to verify this without disturbing Mrs. Packard? That was a question to sleep on, but it took me a long time to get to sleep. End of chapter 13. Recording by Monica Rowley.
"14 of the Mayor's Wife." This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Cosby. The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 14. I Seek Help. A bad night. A very bad night. But for all that, I was down early the next morning. Bess must have her box and I a breath of fresh air before breakfast to freshen me up a bit and clear my mind for the decisive act, since my broken rest had failed to refresh me. As I reached the parlor floor, Nixon came out of the reception room. "Oh, miss," he exclaimed, "going out?" Surprised, doubtless, to see me in my hat and jacket. "A few steps," I answered, and then stopped, not a little disturbed, for in moving to open the door, he had discovered that the key was not in it, and was showing his amazement somewhat conspicuously. "Mrs. Packard took the key up to her room," I explained, thinking that some sort of explanation was in order. "She is nervous, you know, and probably felt safer with it there." The slow shake of his head had a tinge of self-reproach in it. "I was sorry to go out," he muttered. "I was very sorry to go out." But the look which he turned upon me the next minute was of a very different sort. "I don't see how you can go out yet," said he, "unless you go by the back way. That leads into Stanton Street, but perhaps you had just as lief go into Stanton Street." There was impertinence in his voice as well as aggressiveness in his eye, but I smiled easily enough and was turning toward the back with every expectation of going by way of Stanton Street, when Letty came running down the stairs with the key in her hand. I don't think he was pleased, but he opened the door civilly enough, and I gladly went out, taking with me, however, a remembrance of the furtive look with which he had noted the small package in my hand. I pass over the joy with which Bess received the box and its desired contents. I had lost all interest in the matter, which was so entirely personal to herself, and, declining the $10 which I knew she could ill afford, made my visit so short that I was able to take a brisk walk down the street and yet be back in time for breakfast. This, like that of the preceding day, I took alone. Mrs. Packard was well, but preferred to eat upstairs. I did not fret at this. I was really glad, for now I could think and plan my action quite unembarrassed by her presence. The opening under the vestibule floor was to be sounded, and sounded this very morning. But on what pretext? I could not take Mrs. Packard into my counsel, for that would be to lessen the force of the discovery with which I yet hoped to dissipate at one blow the superstitious fears I saw it was otherwise impossible to combat. I might interest Ellen, and I was quite certain that I could interest the cook, but this meant Nixon also, who was always around and whose animosity to myself was too mysteriously founded for me to trust him with any of my secrets, or to afford him any inkling of my real reason for being in the house. Yet help I must have, and very efficient help too. Should I telegraph to Mayor Packard for some sort of order which would lead to the tearing up of this end of the house? I could not do this without fuller explanations than I could give in a telegram. Besides, he was under sufficient pressure just now for me to spare him the consideration of so disturbing a matter, especially as he had left a substitute behind whose business it was not only to relieve Mrs. Packard in regard to the libelous paragraph, but in all other directions to which his attention might be called. I would see Mr. Steele. He would surely be able to think up some scheme by which that aperture might be investigated without creating too much disturbance in the house. An opportunity for doing this was not long in presenting itself. Mr. Steele came in about 9 o'clock and passed at once into the study. The next moment I was knocking at his door, my heart in any mouth but my determination strung up to the point of daring anything and everything for the end I had in view. Fortunately, he came to the door. I could never have entered without his encouragement. As I met his eye, I was ashamed of the color my cheeks undoubtedly showed, but felt reconciled the next minute, for he was not quite disembarrassed himself, though he betrayed it by a little extra paleness rather than by a flush, such as had so disturbed myself. Both of us were quite natural in a moment, however, and answering his courteous gesture, I stepped in and at once opened up my business. "You must pardon me," said I, "for this infringement upon the usual rules of this office. I have something very serious to say about Mrs. Packard. Oh, she's quite well. It has to do with a matter I shall presently explain, and I wish to make a request." "Thank you for the honor," he said, drawing up a chair for me. But I did not sit, neither did I speak for a moment. I was contemplating his features and thinking how faultless they were. "I hardly know where to begin," I ventured at last. "I am burdened with a secret, and it may all appear puerile to you. I don't know whether to remind you first of Mayor Packard's intense desire to see his wife's former cheerfulness restored, a task in which I have been engaged to assist, or to plunge at once into my discoveries, which are a little peculiar and possibly important, in spite of my short acquaintance with the people under this roof and the nature of my position here. You excite me, were his few quick but sharply accentuated words. What secret? What discoveries? I didn't know that the house held any that were worth the attention of sensible persons like ourselves. I had not been looking at him directly, but I looked up at this and was astonished to find that his interest in what I had said was greater than appeared from his tone or even from his manner. "You know the cause of Mrs. Packard's present uneasiness?" I asked. "Mayor Packard told me. The paragraph which appeared in yesterday morning's paper. I have tried to find out its author, but I have failed so far." "That is a trifle," I said. "The real cause—" "No, I prefer to stand," I put in, for he was again urging me by a gesture to seat myself. "The real cause," he repeated, "is one you will smile at, but which you must nevertheless respect. She thinks, she has confided to us in fact, that she has seen within these walls what many others profess to have seen. You understand me, Mr. Steele?" "I don't know that I do, Miss Saunders." "I find it hard to speak it. You have heard, of course, the common gossip about this house, that it is haunted." He smiled somewhat disdainfully. "Yes. Well, Mrs. Packard believes that she has seen what gives this name to the house. A ghost. Yes, a ghost in the library one night." "Ah!" The ejaculation was eloquent. I did not altogether understand it, but its chief expression seemed to be contempt. I began to fear he would not have sufficient sympathy with such an unreasoning state of mind to give me the attention and assistance I desired. He saw the effect it had upon me and hastened to say, "The impression Mrs. Packard has made upon me was of a common-sense woman. I'm sorry to hear that she is the victim of an hallucination. What do you propose to do about it? For I see that you have some project in mind." Then I told him as much of my story as seemed necessary to obtain his advice and to secure his cooperation. I confided to him my theory of the unexplainable sights and sounds which had so unfortunately aroused Mrs. Packard's imagination, and what I had done so far to substantiate it. I did not mention the bonds, nor tell him of Bess and her box, but led him to think that my experiments in the cellar had been the result of my discoveries in the side entrance. He listened gravely. I hardly feel justified in saying with a surprise that was complimentary. I am not sure that it was. Such men are difficult to understand. When I had finished, he remarked with a smile, "So you conclude that the floor of this place is movable, and that the antiquated ladies you mention have stretched their old limbs in a difficult climb just for the game of frightening out tenants they did not desire for neighbors." "I know that it sounds ridiculous," I admitted, refraining still, in spite of the great temptation, from mentioning the treasure which it was the one wish of their lives to protect from the discovery of others. "If they were quite sane, I should perhaps not have the courage to suggest this explanation of what has been heard and seen here. But they are not quite sane. A glance at their faces is enough to convince one of this, and from minds touched with insanity anything can be expected. Will you go with me to this side entrance and examine the floor for yourself? The condition of things under it I will ask you to take my word for. You will hardly wish to visit the cellar on an exploring expedition till you are reasonably assured of its necessity." His eye, which had grown curiously cold and unresponsive through this, turned from me toward the desk before which he had been sitting. It was heaped high with a batch of unopened letters, and I could readily understand what was in his mind. "You will be helping the mayor more by listening to me," I continued earnestly, "than by anything you can do here. Believe me, Mr. Steele, I am no foolish, unadvised girl. I know what I am talking about." He suppressed an impatient sigh and endeavored to show a proper appreciation of my own estimate of myself and the value of my communication. "I am at your service," said he. I wished he had been a little more enthusiastic, but, careful not to show my disappointment, I added as I led the way to the door, "I wish we could think of some way of securing ourselves from interruption. Nixon does not like me, and will be sure to interest himself in our movements if he sees us go down that hall together." "Is there any harm in that?" "There might be. He is suspicious of me, which makes it impossible for one to count upon his conduct. If he saw us meddling with the cabinet, he would be very apt to rush with his complaints to Mrs. Packard, and I am not ready yet to take her into our confidence. I want first to be sure that my surmises are correct." "You are quite right." If any sarcasm tinged this admission, he successfully hid it. "I think I can dispose of Nixon for a short time," he went on. "You are bent upon meddling with this vestibule floor?" "Yes." "Even if I should advise not?" "Yes, Mr. Steele, even if you roused the household and called Mrs. Packard down to witness my folly. But I should prefer to make my experiments quickly and without any other witness than yourself. I am not without some pride to counterbalance my presumption." We had come to a stand before the door as I said this. As I finished, he laid his hand on the knob, saying kindly, "Your wishes shall be considered. Take a seat in the library, Miss Saunders, and in a few moments I will join you. I have a task for Nixon which will keep him employed for some time." At this, he opened the door and I glided out. Making my way to the library, I hastened in and threw myself into one of its great chairs. In another minute I heard Mr. Steele summon Nixon, and in the short interview which followed between them heard enough to comprehend that he was loading the old butler's arms with a large mass of documents and papers for immediate consumption in the furnace. Nixon was not to leave till they were all safely consumed. The grumble which followed from the old fellow's lips was not the most cheerful sound in the world, but he went back with his pile. Presently I heard the furnace door rattle and caught the smell, which I was careful to explain to Ellen as she went by the library door on her way upstairs, lest Mrs. Packard should be alarmed and come running down to see what was the matter. The next moment Mr. Steele appeared in the doorway. "Now what are we to do?" said he. I led the way to what I have sometimes called the recess, for lack of a better name. "This is the place," I cried, adding a few explanations as I saw the curiosity with which he now surveyed its various features. "Don't you see now that cabinet leans to the left? I declare it leans more than it did yesterday. The floor certainly dips at that point." He cast a glance where I pointed and instinctively put out his hand, but let it fall as I remarked, "The cabinet is not so very heavy. If I take out a few of those big pieces of pottery, don't you think we could lift it away from this corner?" "And what would you do then?" "Tear up the carpet and see what is the matter with this part of the floor. Perhaps we shall find not only that, but something else of a still more interesting nature." He was standing on the sill of what had been the inner doorway. As I said these words, he fell back in careless grace against the panel and remained leaning there in an easy attitude, assumed possibly just to show me with what incredulity and yet with what kindly forbearance he regarded my childish enthusiasm. "I don't understand," said he. "What do you expect to find?" "Some spring or button by which this floor is made to serve the purpose of a trap. I'm sure that there is an opening underneath, a large opening. Won't you help me?" I forgot to finish. In my eagerness to impress him, I had turned in his direction and was staring straight at his easy figure and faintly smiling features, when the molding against which he leaned caught my eye. with a total absence of every other thought than the idea which had suddenly come to me, I sprang forward and pressed with my whole weight against one of the edges of the molding, which had a darker hue about it than the rest. I felt it give, felt the floor start from under me at the same moment, and in another heard the clatter and felt the force of the toppling cabinet on my shoulder as it and I went shooting down into the hole I had been so anxious to penetrate, though not in just this startling fashion. The cry uttered by Mr. Steele as I disappeared from before his eyes was my first conscious realization of what had happened after I had struck the ground below. "Are you hurt?" he cried with real commiseration as he leaned over to look for me in the hollow at his feet. "Wait, and I will drop down to you," he went on, swinging himself into a position to leap. I was trembling with the shock and probably somewhat bruised, but not hurt enough to prevent myself from scrambling to my feet as he slid down to my side and offered me his arm for support. "What did you do?" he asked. "Was it you who made this trap give way? I see that it is a trap now," and he pointed to the square boarding hampered by its carpet which hung at one side. "I pressed one of those round knobs in the molding," I explained, laughing to hide the tears of excitement in my eyes. "It had a loose look. I did it without thinking. That is, without thinking enough of what I was doing to be sure that I was in safe enough position for such an experiment. But I'm all right, and so is the cabinet. See?" I pointed to where it stood, still upright, its contents well shaken up, but itself in tolerably good condition. "You are fortunate," said he. "Shall I help you up out of this? Your curiosity must be amply satisfied." "Not yet, not yet," I cried. "Oh, it is as I thought," I now exclaimed, peering around the corner of the cabinet into a place of total darkness. "The passage is here, running directly under the alleyway. Help me, help me. I must follow it to the end. I'm sure it communicates with the house next door." He had to humor me. I already had one hand on the cabinet's edge, and should have pushed it aside by my own strength if he had not interfered. The space we were in was so small, some 4 feet square, I should judge, that the utmost we could do was to shove one corner of it slightly aside, so as to make a narrow passage into the space beyond. Through this I slipped and should have stepped recklessly on if he had not caught me back and suggested that he go first into what might have its own pitfalls and dangers. I did not fear these, but was glad nevertheless to yield to his suggestion and allow him to pass me. As he did so, he took out a match from his pocket and in another moment had lit and held it out. A long, narrow vaulting met our eyes, very rude and propped up with beams in an irregular way. It was empty, save for a wooden stool or some such object which stood near our feet. Though the small flame was insufficient to allow us to see very far, I was sure that I caught the outlines of a roughly made door at the extreme end, and was making for this door, careless of his judgment and detaining hand, when a quick, strong light suddenly struck me in the face. In the square hollow made by the opening of this door, I saw the figure of Miss Charity with a lighted lantern in her hand. She was coming my way. The secret of the ghostly visitations which had deceived so many people was revealed. End of chapter 14. Recording by Tom Cosby.